The United States has been in the midst of its greatest industrialization period since at least World War II, and I would actually argue that the pace of that reindustrialization is faster than what we went through at World War II. The reasons are threefold. Number one, people are starting to think of security as an issue and timeliness of deliveries. Trump helped with that. COVID helped with that. Disruptions because of the Ukraine war are helping with that. Second, because of the shale revolution, the United States has the lowest energy prices in the world in terms of oil as well as electricity, and that makes it kind of important from a processing and a manufacturing point of view. And third is workforce. Despite all the issues that the United States is facing, they're nothing compared to what's going on in the rest of the world. Our baby boomer cadre is about a quarter smaller relative to global norms compared to everybody else. So when they retire, that's a problem, but it's not as much of a problem as elsewhere. And the United States has a large millennial cohort, which most of the world just simply lacks. So whether it's for workers or for consumption, the United States is where it's at. Which brings me to Detroit. This behind me right there, that is the Ambassador Bridge linking Windsor, Ontario with the Motor City. And that one bridge is the densest tradeway for international exchange in the world, handling roughly 1/3, I believe, of all trade between Canada and the United States. Motor City is often called Motor City because it makes a lot of cars, and that bridge handles a lot of the intermediate products that shuttle back and forth across the border between Ontario and Michigan. I expect Detroit to be one of the cities to benefit a lot from the investment that is going to come in from the rest of the world in terms of building out the industrial supply chains, specifically for automotive. Now, the city obviously has challenges. That's going to be the topic of something else, I think. But what to look for? There are three types of investment. The first is portfolio, going into things like stocks and bonds. That really doesn't help Detroit directly. The second is foreign direct investment, where foreign companies come in and set up major operations. That is not something that benefits most of the auto sector in the pre-existing industrial plants in places like Detroit or, say, Houston, but instead favors places where there's underutilized workforces like, say, the American South. And the third is just plain old generic, boring domestic expansion. In the world we are rapidly moving to, the Chinese system is breaking down for a mix of reasons, ranging from political incompetence and mismanagement to energy shortages to trade sanctions. All of those benefit Detroit. We're also seeing a breakdown of the German system because without the energy imports that form the basis of their electricity and petrochemicals model, the rest of the manufacturing doesn't work at all. All this is fantastic for a place that already has a pre-existing industrial base for the sort of industries that need to relocate. Obviously, automotive is going to be the big beneficiary, but also look for things like heavy machinery. We have a shortage in capacity for manufacturing in the United States for things like farming equipment, industrial equipment, mining equipment, construction. And generally, they are produced in similar zones to automotive because in many ways, you're just talking about a more advanced and larger, heavier, more powerful version of your, quote, normal car. Detroit, Detroit, Detroit. The other place to watch, of course, is Houston, where the Gulf Coast meets the Texas Triangle, meets Mexico. Houston might benefit more overall, but it's also, excuse me, a much larger city. Detroit is the place where the outsized benefit is likely to be felt most acutely. Anyway, after 20, 30, 40 years of rough times in Detroit, I think the macroeconomic winds globally are benefiting it in a huge way. And the next 30 years should be very interesting in a good way. Commenting on a sitting president is always dangerous because no matter what I say, I'm going to piss everybody off. So let's just get to it, knowing that that is where this is going to go. In terms of previous experience, the only president that we have ever had that is kind of in the same league as Biden for actually having a real grown-up job is Barack Obama. Sometime around the fall of Rome, Biden was a legal clerk for about a year and a half, and he hasn't had a real job since. He has been in the Senate since about the time of the Crusades, and so he's seen a lot, but he hasn't really done much of anything except for sit on meetings. Now, the negatives of this are obvious. He's guided more by ideology than most presidents because he really doesn't have a lot of real-world experience. On the flip side, dude knows how to run a meeting. And when you bring that attitude, that sort of, for lack of a better word, wisdom into a room, it means you realize that you're not going to know everything. And so you're okay with asking questions. You're okay with showing your belly a little bit. And that means, unlike Donald Trump or Barack Obama, Biden is the most engaged president that we've had in, 13, 14 years. You can even make the argument that when it comes to shaping a policy, he's even better than Clinton or W. He's only 2 years in. I'm not willing to say that he's better or worse than W or Clinton. I think the jury's still out, but he's clearly better than Obama or Trump, simply because he's willing to use the information that's provided and the tools of state. Now, that doesn't mean that I or anyone have to agree with him. I'm simply talking about managerial competence at this point. And in fact, in economic policy, say what you will about Trump. He had a number of people on his cabinet, especially in the first year, that really knew their way around. And say what you will about W, he had some serious leading lights and intellectual heavyweights. Clinton was able to pick people and throw them at problems fairly effectively. And even Obama, while his cabinet was highly ideological and had very little real-world experience, they were all clever people who understand that if you wanted to get something done, you have to use actually the tools of state. Biden's superior to all of them in that regard, in that he understands and trusts in the power of government, but his cabinet is not all that. He really doesn't have anyone on the cabinet who I would consider a leading light in the space that they're supposed to be regulating. But that is not just a negative. There is a positive to that, because there is an understanding throughout his cabinet, taking cues from a boss who doesn't claim to know everything. And for the first time since at least the W administration, cabinet ministers are actually reaching out to industry to ask questions. And that degree of humility is something that I think will bode well for what comes for the next 2 years. That said, I can't say I'm overly impressed with economic policy. I'd probably give that a solid D. Biden is setting us up for a lot of problems that we're going to pay for over the course of the next 50 years. That's a different topic. But on security policy specifically, the fact that Biden was there when the pyramids were built means that he understands what's going on in the world and the broader context of it. So when he sees the Russians carrying out policies that we have not seen for a very long time, he understands exactly where that leads. And so security policy vis-a-vis the Russians and Ukraine and NATO, I kind of give him a B for most of that. Now, security policy is a narrow subset of foreign policy where I am less impressed, which is a narrow subset of all the policies that the president is ultimately responsible for. So I do see some hope. I'm not willing to write off Biden like I have the last 4 at this point. There are reasons to be optimistic, but I think the single biggest one is having a president that doesn't think that he knows everything, and so asks and tries to learn from everybody.